and making sure you're aware of the role of what we now call traditional or mainstream media in Lindsay Adario's story, the power of her images amplified by organizations like Time, National Geographic, the New York Times. It wasn't about Google, it wasn't about Facebook, it wasn't about Twitter, it was about organizations that are willing and able to make the investment in sending a person with Lindsay's talents to places that she just told us about. I think that's a vitally important piece of the story of storytelling, and particularly as it relates to images. Right now, yes, thank you. Right now we're going to hear, we're going to hear from some of the most inspiring direct practitioners of educating people in need, especially in Africa, but in other places as well, Asia, and even in the United States, about everything from health and medicine to governance, environment, economic growth. I'm going to introduce three panelists, and then we'll have a little discussion on a single topic, by no means covering the breadth of the work they do, but focusing and zeroing in on a topic that is especially difficult and sensitive in terms of storytelling. Molly Melching is the founder of Tostan, one of the Hilton Prize's early laureates. She has lived and worked in Senegal since 1974, and her story and the story of Tostan are legendary in the humanitarian community. Among many, many other accomplishments, Melching and Tostan have led to more than 8,000 communities in 8 African countries, declaring their intention formally to abandon female genital cutting. Joining Molly on our panel, Molly's in the middle. Joining Molly on our panel are 2 women who are focusing their careers on the eradication of this practice. Jaha Dukureh, at your left, is founder of Safe Hands for Girls, a survivor-led nonprofit working against the practice of harmful practices against women and girls. She launched a successful campaign to ban what she and the World Health Organization and UNICEF and the United Nations refer to as female genital mutilation in the Gambia. She also gathered national grassroots support to call for the first national survey here in the United States to determine the prevalence of female genital mutilation here. She's a mother and a survivor herself of female genital mutilation and of child marriage. She was listed last year by Time magazine among its most influential women in the world. Mariya Taher, closest to me, is the co-founder of Sahiyo, an organization working to eliminate female genital cutting in certain Shia Islam sects. She has worked in the anti-gender violence field for nearly a decade. She received her Master's of Social Work from San Francisco State University in 2010, where she pursued a qualitative study on understanding female genital cutting in the United States. And I'm emphasizing that because I think most of us don't think of this practice as something that occurs here in the United States. Since then, she's worked on the issue of domestic violence at Women Organized to Make Abuse Non-existent, whose acronym is WOMAN, I-C-C-D-D-R-B. Are you here? Are you listening? Sorry. Mariya also worked at Asian Women's Shelter and Saheli, Support and Friendship for South Asian Women and Families. In 2014, Taher was a Women's Policy Institute Fellow for the Women's Foundation of California, and her team helped pass legislation to provide grants to low-income survivors of domestic violence. In 2015, she co-founded Sahiyo to empower Asian communities to end female genital cutting. She got her Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Lesley University, and I mention that because the writing piece is an important part. Please welcome all 3 of these panelists. I'll join them for a discussion. Okay, Molly, let me ask you first. You have been engaged in this process for many years, maybe 20 years, I think.
20 years.
Right. So on this subject, You're the resident expert from having been here doing this for a long, long time. What's the method that you've found most effective in the communities that you're working in Africa for getting people to move away from this practice?
The method most effective, okay. First, I want to say hello to everybody and just mention the fact that today is a very appropriate day to be talking about this issue because it is the International Day of the Girl Child. And I think that because this practice affects so many girls around the world, even in the United States, even here in Los Angeles, that it is very appropriate that we discuss this. The approach that Tostan used, we actually, you might be surprised to learn, never set out with the goal of ending female genital cutting. We started with an education program. I had lived in Senegal for many years, and I was able to visit many communities in Senegal for a radio program that we were actually doing for children. And it was while in these villages that I realized how desperately women needed information on their own health, on leadership skills, and on the environment. So many critical issues that they needed in order to be part of the decision-making process in their communities, and that they weren't getting because they weren't in school, and because also they didn't have a chance to actually sit down and discuss these issues together. So we started a community, what we call the Community Empowerment Program, and I founded Tostan in 1991 to work with UNICEF actually to spread this basic education program that had as a goal to give the information to people they needed in order to make very important decisions about their future. And we worked for 8 years on this program, and it was very successful, and we had been to hundreds of communities, and we decided at one point that we needed to listen more carefully to the participants now. What did they want to learn more about? And they told us, we want to learn about our health. We don't know about our bodies. We don't know about menstruation, childbirth, menopause. We don't really understand all these issues. And they also said, we want to learn about female genital cutting. And I was very taken aback because as a white American, I felt like this is such a taboo and sensitive topic because this was in 1995. But because the women had asked to include this in a module on women's health, we actually did include that. But luckily, we also realized that it was very important to discuss human rights. It was, we did many sessions on human rights so that women would know they had the right to speak out, and it would give them the confidence to more effectively address these issues, the right to health. And we included a session on female genital cutting. But it was part of a larger program that was holistic, that included many other subjects that were of interest not only to the women, but the men too. And much to our surprise, many of the participants in the program decided that it was time they ended this practice. And we were surprised. I was more surprised than anyone when this happened.
You didn't advocate that? You didn't advocate that, or you?
We never said in the classroom, you need to stop this practice. I think what we wanted to do was give them the information and pretty much say, you are the ones who need to decide this, not Molly. Of course, I wasn't teaching the classes. Tostan is 99% African. The facilitators in the communities were the ones who had also undergone this practice and who were throwing this out as a question. Is this going to help us to achieve the goals of this community, goals of health and well-being? And in 10 years, do we want to have these same problems that we're having and that the women would bring up in the classroom often for the first time? They talked about their daughters having hemorrhaged. They talked about their daughters who had even died. And no one had discussed this before. It was a very nurturing space where we had been there for 3 years when we did these sessions. So that's very important. There was trust involved. And I'm happy to say that because of this, there was one village that stood up on their own pretty much, very courageously said, we have decided to abandon it. And that movement spread as we did the program in many communities throughout Senegal and then West Africa, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, where the practice was almost 100%, 94%, Guinea almost 100%, and have had the same results. That it is a holistic education program. People need information in their own language. And the human rights, I think, was so critical. Learning they had rights. It was empowering for the women. They could speak out. They had reasons. They could talk about their health consequences, and that they had the right to good health, and that they had the responsibility to make sure that their daughters were in good health. And so that approach was very powerful. And then it was inclusive. We worked a lot with the religious leaders and the village chief, and made sure that everyone was included in this dialogue and decision to come together and to abandon the practice. And I think probably the most important word was respectful. Everything was done out of great respect, understanding that people did not do this to harm their daughters. They did it because they were trapped in a social norm that meant that they were expected to do this, and there would be harsh sanctions if they did not. And it was really a social value, such that it was very difficult for them previously to even talk about it. And the fact that they could come together as a united family meant that they could finally abandon the practice, because they would no longer be sanctioned negatively for having practiced the FGC.
Thanks, Molly. Jaha, I want to ask you to tell your story. Jaha is a survivor of the practice herself, but there's an interesting backstory to her family and how she came to where she is. And you have to sort of do a fast forward, I would say, from Molly's environment, which started decades ago, to Jaha's, which is much more recent than that. Tell us your story.
So I was born in the Gambia, which is surrounded by Senegal, and we have the same culture, language, food, and everything in similar with Senegal. And I went through FGM when I was 1 week old, and I was brought to America at the age of 15 to marry an older man. And that was when I first realized what FGM was and what it meant to my body. And I moved to Atlanta, and I left that marriage after 2 months and then remarried again the second time at the age of 17 and moved to Atlanta. And then I started having children. And when I delivered my daughter, who's my second child, I realized that a lot of the things that I went through, I can't allow my daughter to go through that. I come from a very, very religious family. My father's an imam, and I come from the most conservative tribe in the Gambia, which is the Soninke tribe. We practice FGM and child marriage 100% of the time. But I knew that it was very, very important that women like me spoke out about this issue. I knew that the only way we were going to get the world's attention and our community's attention is if we started speaking out. No one was going to do it for us. At the time I was living in Atlanta, so I started a survivor group in my living room where I brought together other women in my community that were born in the United States. We talked about issues that we were facing, from our sexuality to different issues that no one was talking about in our community. That led to me starting a Change.org petition, because I wanted President Obama to look at the number of women living in the United States that are impacted by this issue. More than 220,000 people signed my petition, and President Obama ordered the CDC to look into the issue, which found that over 500,000 women are living with this in the United States. After the successful campaign of what I did in the United States, we also pushed for a law which made it illegal to transport girls out of the US for the purpose of FGM. I decided to take my campaign back home to the Gambia. I started the first youth-led movement against the practice in the Gambia, and we went out in the streets, we talked to religious leaders, we pushed buttons. I think for us, we were very, very respectful in our approach, but FGM is not okay. There are 200 million girls around the world that are living with this practice. For us, it wasn't about being careful. It was about letting our fathers, our religious leaders, our politicians know that this is no longer okay with our generation. And exactly 1 year after we launched our campaign in the Gambia, the president of the Gambia at the time banned FGM, and 1 month later, our parliament made it illegal to practice FGM in our country. 3 months later, that followed with a law against child marriage as well. for us, it's no longer about the fact that we went through this practice. We know that there's a younger generation. I mean, when I think about my daughter, when I think about my grandchildren in the future, FGM is ending in Africa. It's not because we're afraid. It's because women like us are leading the change in our conversations. It's like women like us are telling our parents and the people in our society that we will no longer accept this. We don't accept a government or a society that respects cultural norms more than they respect our own human rights, and we will not accept that. We respect our culture. I'm a proud African. It's my identity, it's who I am, and I carry that everywhere that I go. But this is one part of my culture that I will never have respect for. And I think it's very, very important that people understand that. 63 million girls have already lived through FGM. Every single day, 6,000 girls are cut. If this was in America where someone was cutting their daughter's hand or someone was cutting their daughter's ears, we will not be okay with it. And we will not think that it's a cultural norm. Foot binding used to be a thing in China, but when they wanted to end it, it took them 10 years for them to end it. And as a human society, it's our responsibility to make sure that this practice ends. And we can't do that by being careful. We can't do that by being afraid that people will see us as racist or being intolerant to other people's culture. It's not about their culture. It's about humanity. It's about those girls.
Jaha, I want to follow up on two things. You touched on, both you and Molly, and Mariya hasn't spoken on this yet, but we'll get there. Both you and Molly have mentioned the religious aspect of this. You said you spoke with, your organization spoke with religious leaders as well, and the participants in your program spoke with religious leaders, and you mentioned it as well. Is this a religiously decreed practice? You said your dad's an imam, so you speak with some authority on that.
It's not. I mean, you think about Islam is one of the most beautiful religions out there. And you think about the concept of harm in Islam. I think one of the arguments that we've used that's been so effective is when we go into the community, Islam is that religion that makes it harm for you to tattoo your body or pierce your body. And how can that same religion allow you to cut off a girl's clitoris, to cut off a girl's labia? So I think for us, there's nowhere in the Quran that says that FGM is something that should happen. There's no authentic hadith in Islam that proves the point that people are trying to make. There's a lot of people that believe that this is a religious requirement. Even our president's imam in the Gambia, I remember having a meeting with him. I had a 2-hour conversation with him where he told me that I was going to go to hell and this and that. And eventually, this same guy for decades that's been preaching on TV, on radio, on newspaper, telling people to cut their children, is the same guy that finally came out and said that this is not a religious obligation. And we had him on tape. We spreaded it in the Gambia like wildfire. He was mad, but for us, it's not about him.
So the perception of this as a religiously decreed process is a misperception, not just among those of us who are not involved in it every day, but also among those who practice it every day.
Exactly. In the Gambia, for instance, 70% of the people that practice FGM believe that it's a religious obligation. That's the reason why this practice is happening. And if we are going to tackle it, we need to break those myths.
Okay, now I just want to follow up one more thing with Jaha for just a second. You have mentioned your dad a couple of times. Mm-hmm. Have you ever sat down face to face with him and said, Father, whatever you call him, I want to talk to you about this issue, and how did that go?
So when I first went to Gambia, even before I did anything publicly, I had a conversation with my dad. And at the time, my whole family disassociated themselves with me. I was the black sheep of the family. I was that shame, the one that's constantly bringing bad things in our family. And I remember it was hard going through that phase with my dad. But I remember right before FGM was banned in the Gambia, I had a baby sister. My dad has 3 wives and he's still having children. So one of his youngest wives delivered a baby. And I was on the campaign at the time and I received the call that my dad's wife delivered. And I knew that in my family, FGM happens when babies are 1 week old. So I rushed back home and had a conversation with my stepmom as well as my dad. It was a very, very difficult conversation. But for the first time in my family, Khadija was the first girl to not go through this practice in our family, and that in itself is change. And to me, it shows that it is possible for us to change mindsets. My dad is a very influential imam in the Gambia with so much respect, and people know him. But because now his daughter don't have to go through FGM. Other people that believe in him, other people that follow him, they've also abandoned the practice, and it has that ripple effect that continues to happen in our community. So that's why I think it's very, very important for us to not be afraid to push buttons.
Okay. Mariya, sorry, I don't want you to think I've passed over you, but I wanted to work through that first. Mariya is coming here from Detroit, where she's been, and you heard Jaha say that they were involved in a survey discovering the practice in the United States, or the extent of the practice in the United States. Mariya has been involved in that too. Can you tell us a little bit about the cases that you're involved in Michigan? What it's in the United States, who is it in the United States, what communities is it in, and the kind of work that you're doing about it?
Sure. So yes, I was in Michigan literally the day before I got here. And for those who are not familiar, this past April, a doctor was charged with performing female genital cutting on 2 minor 7-year-old girls. And this is actually the first time that anyone has been charged under the federal statute that criminalizes FGC in the United States. That law passed in 1996, but no one has ever been charged until this April.
It hasn't been enforced since 1996.
Well,
so what, is it a feel-good thing to just pass it, or?
I think it goes to show just how underground this issue is, and how secretive it is, and the communities that are practicing it. In a way, I mean, it varies on community to community, but it is something that is so ingrained that even when there is a law against it, it's something that people feel because of it's a social norm that you must continue. But the community in which it was found is a community from India. It's the Dowdy-Bora community. It's a community that I was actually raised in. I'm born in the United States, and I actually underwent FGC too when I was 7 years old, and my family took me back to India. My sister underwent it when she was in the United States as well. But at the time both of us had it, there was no federal law in place either. But now there is a law, and it happened within the same community. This is a very small community, but it's also a community, because it's an Indian community, I think it's breaking a lot of stereotypes and misperceptions around who FGC happens to, because it is something that is very global, but it's only in the last few years that it's really being recognized as being global. It crosses religions, it crosses ethnicities, it crosses income backgrounds. A lot of the community members where in Michigan, a lot of these families are really, well off and well educated. The Dowdy-Bora community too is considered to be very well educated and very well off economically. And it's something that I think there's this misconception that it only happens to one type of person, and that's wrong. And that's something that I think we really need to address, and we really need to show that it is something that it's so ingrained in the communities where it's practiced that that's part of the challenge of having to stop it, because it's a learned form of violence as well. So it's something that, Jaha's story and her example completely shows that, where it's just generation after generation is continuing it. And until one person breaks that cycle, that violence is just going to continue over and over again.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Do you think that the cases in Michigan, which presumably will get some publicity and be spoken about elsewhere other than in the Detroit area, do you think that we'll discover in the next, let's say, decade or so that this practice is being engaged in more widely in the United States?
I think so. And I think another thing is now I believe there are 8 people that have been charged, and it has come out that there are probably 100 girls that have been affected. And one of the things also is with the CDC study that Jaha had mentioned, and the statistics, they found that 500,000 girls have undergone in the United States. Those numbers actually don't include me or any of the girls in Detroit. They only include girls from 30 countries that are mostly in Africa and the Middle East. So it's really ignoring the rest of the world. And Sahiyo, the organization that I helped co-found, really focuses on FGC happening within South Asian communities. And once we started working, we worked first primarily within the community. We were raised in the Dowdy-Bora community. But because we've been doing a lot of work, and a lot of our work is storytelling, which I can mention too, but we've had other communities, other South Asian communities, reach out to us and tell us it's happening in their communities as well, other than Dowdy-Bora's. And it's something that we were surprised to learn that it was happening, but we were at the same time, it was surprising, but at the same time, it's like, well, that makes sense, because it was just, this is so silenced, and it's almost baffling how silenced it's been, in that it hasn't been recognized or it hasn't been acknowledged. But we know it happens in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Russia, South America, United States, United Kingdom, Australia. It goes on and on and on.
So, and Molly, I think, was the first one to mention the word taboo, but I think you've all mentioned it at this point. Are we at a breaking point, or do you think we are at a breaking point on this issue where the taboo is being broken? And what is it that's going to be the force of tide that will move the education process dramatically forward to reaching all of the communities that you just mentioned? Molly, do you want to comment on that?
The methods that we've been using are that through people coming together and then being educated, understanding, and being able themselves. These are women who've never been to school, but who can really explain the issues so well and reach out to their extended family. They go sometimes to over 200, 300 communities to talk to their relatives, even across borders. A lot of the families in Senegal intermarry in Mali or in Gambia or in Guinea-Bissau, and they've gone beyond those borders to say, listen, as a family, let us not be divided around this. Let us come together and decide together to end this, and let us meet in what we call the public declaration. Jaha was talking about China. One of the ways that they ended foot binding in China was through these public declarations. I didn't know that when this first started in Senegal, where people started coming together as a family and saying, we are declaring today that we will not cut our daughters anymore, so don't worry about the taboo against not doing it, and that girls will no longer be ostracized and marginalized if they don't do this. And they will find a husband, because a lot of the times the women feel obliged to practice female genital cutting because they are afraid that their daughters will not find a good husband. And so by doing these public declarations, the people themselves who practice this forever are in front of the camera and talking on TV and explaining the problems that they had. And the religious leaders, because we do a lot of work with the religious leaders, we have even an Islamic rights specialist who's at Tostan who leads seminars with the religious leaders and tells them this is not in the Quran. As Jaha said, this is not an Islamic practice, and make sure that people understand this is not about changing your values. We call it values deliberation and values alignment, that human rights and Islam can really be on the same, that you can really align them and that they can correspond, and you can help to end abuses of girls and women and actually be in the forefront. You can be leaders in this movement, and that has been very successful. And through these public declarations where the women speak out and the religious leaders speak out, we've reached literally thousands, if not millions, of people on the television, on the radio, such that people now are talking more about it, much more than ever before. They're not afraid to discuss it. And it's leading to what we call a critical mass of people really saying it is time to end this practice. And I just think, it's when people do speak out, like Jaha and the work she's doing, and Mariya, I think that there's great hope that this will end in our generation.
Now, all three of you obviously are here as women advocates, and I think in all of the stories you've told, you've spoken a lot about helping women to understand how to deal with this issue and how to speak out about it and how to tell the story and so on. But Jaha's story also, and Molly, your reference to religious leaders makes this point too. Do you have programs? Tell me a little bit about the storytelling you use when you're addressing men who maybe wrongly believe this is a religious dictate or a cultural one or a political one perhaps, or whatever. Is there a difference in the way you tell the story when you tell it with men or to men than it is when you're telling it with women or working with women? Do you want to address that?
Sure. So Sahiyo, we do a lot of work around storytelling where we work with survivors, but not just survivors, but with also men from the community, and also women from the community who have not been cut to share their stories and to really make it know what they've gone through. And we originally started with just sharing stories from survivors because we felt it was important to let them tell their stories and get that out there. And really the idea was building a critical mass, as Molly had mentioned too. And then afterwards, we really recognized that to really affect change at a larger level, we needed to really have the entire community involved, and we needed men involved too. And so then we started hearing from men who wanted to talk about just the mixed feelings that they were having, feelings of guilt, or in some situations where they felt they couldn't do anything and it was a woman's decision, or other regret for what had happened. And we felt those stories were so powerful, and we wanted those voices to be heard. So we started collecting their stories and helping them share their stories through blogs and through videos as well. And another thing is we recognized is there was this silence amongst the women who had not been cut. Sahiyo, one of the things that we did was we did a smaller study to learn how prevalent this was within the Diaspora community, and this was one of the first things we did back in 2015 when we more officially came together. And it was a little bit based off of the study that I did when I was in graduate school too. But we had over 400 women from this community take part in the study, and they were telling us their stories, and we learned that 80% of them had been cut. So we confirmed that this was a pretty prevalent practice within the community. We also learned that 81% said they didn't want it to continue on to the next generation. But that was just not known. Everyone thought that this is what you did and it had to continue. And we realized we need to let people know that they actually don't want this to continue. And it was one of the ways we did that was also like, okay, we need to talk to the women who have not been cut and ask them to share their stories. And for instance, in my own family, I know that some of my cousins haven't been cut because my aunts decided not to do it to their daughters, but some of them had not. For example, I spoke at an event in New York, and I have an aunt in New York and in Chicago, and they're really close sisters, and they had both independently decided not to have their kids undergo it. But they never told each other until I went to that event and spoke that they had decided that.
Because they were being silent about it.
Exactly, because they were afraid of what would happen if it was found out that their kids had not undergone it too. What
are they afraid of? The things Jaha and Molly were talking about? That they wouldn't get a good husband, or?
In this community, I don't know if it's much of as an effect of good a husband as being socially outcasted from the community, excommunicated. There's a huge fear of backlash, and there's a huge fear of just not belonging and not being able to go to the mosque or being buried in the cemetery, or there is fear along with marriage too. For instance, if you wouldn't be able to find a significant partner for your daughter or for your son to marry too. So there is a lot of backlash. There's a lot of control within the community, and that really stops a lot of people from speaking out.
So you mentioned social media in your storytelling effort, blogs and videos, you said. Jaha, what are the techniques that you're using to get this story out? And I guess I'm especially interested in the different audiences that you have to address. You're talking to the women, you're talking to religious leaders, you're talking to men, you're talking to older women who, in many families, I guess, make this decision for their kids.
I'm sorry to all the men in the audience, but when it comes to FGM, men are so clueless in our community. They just don't know anything. I think when we are talking to men, like right now, half of my team in the Gambia is young men. But I remember when we first started this work, a lot of men didn't even understand that their women are in pain because they had experienced FGM. So I think for us, being out there in the media, because we are members of the community, we are women who have experienced this practice. When we speak about our pain, they can't deny that, they can't ignore that. So that allowed them to understand exactly what their wives, their mothers, and their daughters will have to endure if we don't end this practice. And that allowed us to get people's attention because it was our voices, it was our stories in their native languages. And I remember with the religious leaders, a lot of them denied that this was a problem because they thought it was perfectly fine and no one has ever died as a result of this. And when we started speaking out, when we started showing cases, when we started showing how fistulas are related to FGM, how a lot of the issues the women were facing, a lot of times what we found was it was the men that actually said, you know what, we don't want this for our wives. We want them to enjoy sex. We didn't realize that our women were not enjoying sex because they had gone through FGM. So I think in a sense, it was about how we led the conversation. Our programs are in all the schools in the Gambia right now. We have school clubs. I mean, the reason why I think we work with the younger generation, especially young people, is the fact that our parents have already done this. Chances are some of them might change their minds. Chances are some of them will never agree with us. But for the first time, we have a chance to make sure that this doesn't continue. With the younger generation, from a young age, if they accept that this is something that they don't want to carry forward, it means that their children will never have to go through FGM. So I think it's that messaging and knowing what population you're working with and how you go about addressing them. When we're talking with the religious leaders, we are a bit more conservative. When we're talking with the cutters, we are a bit more open with them because they're the ones that did the cutting, and we want them to understand that those hands, I mean, my organization is called Safe Hands for Girls. And I remember the reason why we named it Safe Hands for Girls is the idea of wanting those hands that do the cutting to turn safe. And we want girls that come into our organization to know that they're coming into safe hands. And that was the whole idea of why we named the organization Safe Hands. And yes, so it's about our voices. We use radio a lot. Ever since I started this work, we've partnered with the Guardian newspaper in London. And they've covered our work a lot, which has allowed the world to know who I am. So in a way, it's because of the media. In a way, it's because of social media that allowed people to know who I am, that allowed me to be somewhat of an inspiration to a lot of girls in my community who are now saying that they want to be like me. I remember like people like Alam Rabid have inspired me to want to do this work. I look at her, we're Facebook friends, and I remember it's because I saw a woman like her that I identified with. I wanted to be like that, and a lot of girls in my community see that in me as well.
Molly mentioned radio and television. You mentioned radio, but also social media. You talked about videos and social media. I think for us in the United States, there's this perception that the media has all become social media, that nobody's reading the New York Times anymore, nobody's looking at the Los Angeles Times, nobody's using these television, what's on television, you know, we don't watch television news anymore. But in the societies where you're working, and on this issue in particular, what are the most effective methods? Now, you talked about social media, Jaha, as leading to your prominence, but I doubt, but correct me if I'm wrong, whether the school children in the Gambia are they getting this message on Facebook and Twitter?
No. So in the Gambia, one of the most effective tools that we are using is community radios. A lot of the women that have been doing the cutting that have decided they won't do it anymore, we have radio listening groups where they're listening to our messages, and we give them radios. And the school children, what they're doing is they have school clubs in their schools. And they go out in their communities and do their own activity. We equip them with the tools and resources that they need in order for them to be able to talk about this. We use our experiences, some of the things that we did right and some of the things that we did wrong. And but when I say social media, I mean the outside world. The people in the United States, the people that have access to the money, the people that have access to the power.
And can make the programs proliferate, right?
Exactly. So it's like, if you don't have, even though this is so wrong, but if you don't have the attention of the UN folks or the money people, it doesn't matter how much you want to do good, it's just not realistic. So because of social media, I was able to get those people's attention. I remember John Lewis told me one thing when I was leaving Atlanta and going back home. He told me if I wanted to make a difference, I needed to be a loudmouth. So through social media, I became a loudmouth.
But I insist also, before this ends, on saying how important education is. And education, unfortunately, in the formal school is not always succeeding. And I believe so strongly that by providing basic education, we have a 3-year program where people learn much more than just negative or harmful traditional practices, but who get practice with leadership. And we've had hundreds of women elected now to rural councils and are making a difference in the decisions that are being made in the districts throughout the country. And this is so, so important, that an empowering education where people learn their human rights and responsibilities has really been the key to making deep social change in so many different areas. And one of those areas is this practice where we're seeing thousands of communities abandoning. So I really want to stress that point, that there is this great need for all these women who've never been to school or who dropped out of school. and have no space, no nurturing, safe space to discuss these issues. So I think this will be really important as they are mothers, and that they can advocate for ending these practices also. I just have to say how very important education and empowering education is right now in all these communities.
Mariya, you're going to have the last word here today.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that also. I think it's really also a lot about breaking silence and allowing for safe spaces where people can come together to have these discussions. So my co-founders in India too, this past year have started doing gatherings where they call Talpe Charcha, which is basically discussions over food, where they're having women coming together in places where they can talk about this topic. And really, that's really the first step, because for so long, this just wasn't being talked about. And I think each of our communities are maybe at different stages in terms of advocacy and awareness on this issue, but that's something that we're doing right now too, is recognizing, wow, this is finally at this point where the media is paying attention to it, and it is something that is known. It happens in India, it happens in South Asia. People didn't know that really. People still don't know that now, but people really didn't know that a few years ago. And I think that's vital, that breaking that silence and allowing for venues and for forums for anyone to be able to speak up.
Mariya Taher, Molly Melching, and Jaha Dukureh, thank you very much for being with us today.